In a previous lesson, we learned that all living things possess a set of characteristics that make them alive. And we said that on Earth, cells were the smallest living things. Cells are self-sustaining chemical systems capable of Darwinian evolution. Everything on Earth that is alive is composed of a cell because cells can meet all of those characteristics that we saw on that list. In this lesson, we'll examine how cells operate. We'll tackle some big questions. What's going on in cells? How do cells manage to have all the characteristics on the list? Why are cells so small? Are there common features to all cells? And how can a living thing be composed of non-living parts? Now, we've already learned that both animals and plants are multicellular organisms. They are composed of many cells stuck together. Here we see one of those cells from a human. This is a cheek cell. And here is a leaf cell from an aquatic plant. Here's the cartoon version up here. And in this lesson, then, we're going to start off by noting some similarities and differences between these two kinds of cells. First, the similarities. Both types of cells, animal and plant cells, have an outer cell membrane. This is a flexible barrier. We'll learn more about it in a moment. Both have a fluid cytoplasm, both have a nucleus, and both have structures called mitochondria. What's unique about the plant cell is, of course, it has those green discs, the chloroplasts, the site of photosynthesis, and they have a rigid cell wall as well. Now, in this lesson, we're going to begin by considering these kinds of cells, cells with a nucleus, but then we'll expand our view to look at all cells on Earth. First, if the cell does have a nucleus and mitochondria, we're going to call that, for the purposes of this course, we're going to call them complex cells. So animal cells and plant cells will be complex cells. They're fairly large cells, they have a nucleus, and they've got these structures called mitochondria. Now, if we take a look at an actual plant cell under the microscope, so this again is the leaf cell from an aquatic plant, we've got the outer cell wall, right, that rigid boundary. Inside the cell wall, just inside the cell wall, is the cell membrane. Can't see it very well here. We have the nucleus, shown here. We have the fluid cytoplasm, and we have the green discs, the chloroplasts. Now, in this lesson, first we're going to focus on the features that are common to animal and plant cells, and then we'll end with a look at features that all cells possess. So the common features will be the cell membrane, cytoplasm, and nucleus, and we're also going to add the mitochondria as well. It's just that in these microscope pictures, it's hard to see the mitochondria. Now, let's take the cell membrane first. Here we see the outer boundary of the cheek cell, and that is a flexible boundary called the cell membrane. The cell membrane keeps the cell's contents together so that life-sustaining molecular interactions can occur. Now, that's a mouthful there. We're just going to call that the chemistry of life. It's happening in the fluid, in the cytoplasm here, but the membrane keeps all those molecules together so that this thing can remain alive. Now, over here, you're seeing a scene where an amoeba, the silvery thing, the larger silvery blob here, has eaten 4 paramecia, but the amoeba's membrane has ruptured here. And so here we have some of the fluid leaking out. And this can be fatal, right, for a cell. See, because the cell membrane has to keep all of the contents of the cell together for the proper chemistry to occur so that the cell can remain alive. Now, in this picture here, we're going to make a comparison. Of course, we're familiar with the fact that animals eat, and animals also get rid of waste. So here we have the elephant eating and pooping. Well, animals eat and get rid of waste because animals are composed of cells, and each cell is doing the microscopic equivalent. It's taking up food and getting rid of waste. So animals need food and produce waste because their cells need food and produce wastes. Now, the cell membrane then is an important structure in this regard. The cell membrane regulates the flow of materials into and out of the cell. For example, food has to enter the cell across the cell membrane. And why is that important for a cell? Well, food is a source of energy and also building supplies. One of the principal energy molecules for an animal cell, for example, would be glucose. That's a sugar. So glucose has to be imported into the cell. In animals like us, we have glucose in our blood. That's the sugar in our blood that is the fuel for our cells. Now, waste must also be removed from the cell. Why? Well, waste must be removed because it interferes with the chemistry that sustains life. If you get a buildup of certain waste molecules, it interferes with important chemistry, putting the cell's life in jeopardy. Now in this picture, we'll take a look at what cell membranes are composed of. So here again we have our cheek cell, and here's a cartoon version of the cell membrane. So the water here inside would be the cytoplasm of the cell here, and then the water outside, that would be the water outside of the cell, right, or the fluid outside the cell. So the cell membrane is composed of molecules called lipids. And lipids are constructed from fat molecules, actually, in our diet, but they form a flexible barrier, right, a boundary to the cell. In fact, if you look closely, there are two layers of these lipids. So a lipid consists of a little kind of head region of the molecule, and then these little tails, two little tails coming off the head, and there's two layers of those molecules. So sometimes it's called a lipid bilayer, bi for two. So we've got two layers of these molecules called lipids, and that forms a flexible boundary that we call the cell membrane. Now, interestingly, if the cell membrane was composed of lipids only, large food molecules would not be able to enter the cell. You'll recall that glucose is an important food molecule for a cell. Well, glucose would not be able to cross this barrier. That's how effective the lipid membrane is at being a barrier. Well, that raises a puzzle. How does food then get into the cell? Well, the answer can be seen in this picture. Here now we see a cross-section of the cell membrane, and this is one lipid molecule right here. Here's the head of the molecule, and we've got these two little tails, and these tails are very similar to the fat molecules that we get in our diet. So we've got the two layers of lipids, that's the membrane, but in the membrane are these blue things. These are molecules called proteins, and they assist in transporting food and waste across the membrane. So here we have, we can kind of see that the protein is acting like a channel, or it's going to shuttle, molecules across the membrane. Now, proteins then make the membrane selectively permeable, allowing only certain molecules to enter and exit the cell. So large molecules cannot cross the membrane by themselves. They need help from proteins. Very small molecules, oxygen and carbon dioxide molecules, they can go through the membrane directly. But large molecules, which are often important kinds of molecules, have to be shuttled into the cell with the aid of proteins. So if we step back and look at what's going on here. Here we have our cell. The chemistry of life must be occurring in the fluid here, but to do that chemistry, you're going to need food, right? And to get the food into the cell, we need these molecules called proteins that are inserted into the membrane, and they serve as channels to allow large molecules to cross the membrane and get into the cell. Likewise, there must be special protein channels to export the waste out of the cell. We'll be learning that proteins are large molecules that perform a wide variety of tasks in the cell. There are thousands of different kinds of proteins, and each has a specific job to do. Controlling the traffic across the cell membrane is one of the important jobs that proteins perform. Now, this is our picture of an amoeba again, a single-celled organism that lives in ponds and streams. And for those types of creatures, the membrane defines the boundary of the self. So for the amoeba, it's the cell membrane that is that distinguishes the amoeba from the world, right? That is the boundary of the amoeba as a living organism compared to the external environment. So the cell membrane is doing lots of important things. It's keeping all of the cell together. It's controlling the traffic of molecules into the cell and out of the cell. And in single-celled organisms, it is the boundary of the self. So we can ask the question, why are single-celled organisms microscopic? The answer will involve some geometry considerations. We'll have to consider the surface area of cells and the volume of cells and see how the two relate. So in the next 3 slides, we'll try to figure out why cells are so small. Because cells import food across their membranes, their ability to get energy is related to the surface area of their membrane. Let's pause here for a moment. Take a look at these three diagrams. Notice there are two words for each cell. So here's a small cell, medium-sized cell, larger cell. And the word production means energy production. So the size of the word production, notice it's getting bigger here. The size of that word tells us that as the cell gets bigger, it will be able to transport more food across its cell membrane because there is more cell membrane. So energy production will go up. The cell can produce more energy with a larger surface area. However, you'll notice that the need here, the word need here, represents the energy need of a cell. And as it turns out, the energy need of a cell is related to the cell's volume. So here's the geometrical problem. As cells grow, their surface area also grows, as we see that they can produce more energy because the surface area is larger, they can import more food, they have more protein channels in their membrane. But, it's a big but, the energy needs of a cell are related to its volume. As the cell grows, its volume grows faster than its surface area. So big cells face an energy shortage. Cells must remain small. Now notice in the picture, I've purposely made it so that while as the cell gets bigger, the word production does get bigger, but the word need gets bigger faster. And so a cell like this, its need for energy will exceed the ability of it to import food across its membrane. So this is one of the reasons why this is a main reason why cells must remain small. They face energy shortages when they grow too big. Now, if cells must remain small, well, how is it that we have large creatures like animals and plants? Now remember, large creatures like animals and plants are multicellular. So organisms can achieve larger size by being multicellular. Each cell is small enough to meet its energy needs, but the cooperation of many cells allows an organism to reap the benefits of larger size. In this diagram here, let's take a look at a cell like this. So it appears to be a kind of a rather large cell, right? And it's going to have trouble. It's going to have trouble getting enough food, which is energy for the cell, across that cell membrane. So this is a problem. A large cell like this would be difficult to manage for a cell. The energy needs of the cell would be too great to import enough food. However, look at this diagram over here. Notice it is the same absolute size as the single cell over here, but here we have 9 cells. Each is smaller. And so the idea is smaller cells have sufficient surface area to import enough food to meet the cell's energy needs. So you can get big. Organisms on Earth got big. And we call them animals and plants, but they got big not by growing really huge cells, but by putting a whole bunch of small cells together into a large organism. In the next lessons, we'll take a look at some other main components. We'll look at the cytoplasm, mitochondria, and the nucleus.